Welcome once again to our worship service here on this Independence Day of 2020. You know, it doesn't happen so often that it happens on Sabbath, but it happens this year. The last time that 4th of July was on Sabbath was in 2015, and the next time, I believe I looked it up, is going to be 2026. So we have an opportunity to think about independence, and what we're going to be thinking about today is more in the line of defining what is independence, what is liberty, what is freedom. So please bow your heads with me as we begin our study today. Father in heaven, thank you that today in America we have freedom to worship. Even though right now we are, for the most part, not able to worship in person as we have been used to, we still can be together in spirit and in truth. And so, Lord, as we study your word today, I pray that your spirit will fall upon us. Be with me as I share this message, and may what is said be from on high. May all those listening near and far be blessed by your word today. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're going to be posting the PowerPoint on our website as we usually do, and you feel free to download it if you would like to have access to that. These are the segments of our study that we're going to be looking at today. In a daring declaration, we're going to take a look a little bit of the history of what brought about the reason for our celebration on 4th of July. Divine direction, different definitions, prophecy's picture, and then imminent independence. What was produced in 1776 was called the Declaration of Independence. And after a short preamble, we find these words that have become renowned for their profound truth that is spoken. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is part of the Declaration of Independence, and it was a daring declaration. It was putting oneself in the jeopardy of the crime of treason, which in their day would be subject to be death by hanging. And those that put their signatures on that document were taking a very bold stand. Now, this came about in the Continental Congress by virtue of a motion that was made by the delegate, one of the delegates from Virginia, Richard Henry Lee. And on June 7th, he made a motion that some declaration be formulated to proclaim that in an official way, separation from England was to be pursued by the 13 American colonies. But while he made that motion, they really weren't able to vote on anything substantive at that time. So the vote was postponed, and there was a committee of 5 individuals that was formed. On that committee, there was John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and 2 other individuals. And they spent the next couple of weeks putting together what we call the Declaration of Independence. It was formally adopted by the Continental Congress on the 4th of July. But did you know that it was actually signed 2 days before that, July 2? So while we sometimes refer to July 4th as being commemorative of the signing of the Declaration, it's really more accurate to say it's in commemoration of the adoption by the Continental Congress. July 2 was the date that they put their signatures on that document. And this was felt so strongly by John Adams that July 2 should be the date that would be the day that we would commemorate. That in years after this, when 4th of July was the day that was chosen to be the day of celebration, if he was invited to go to a gathering and give a speech, give remarks, he would decline going because he was kind of in protest with regard to the date being 4th of July. He felt very strongly July 2 should be the date that was the date that celebration would take place. So the 5-person committee came up with this document, but it was largely written by Thomas Jefferson. I was interested to find out that July 4 as a legal holiday was not set aside until 1941. Prior to that time, there were celebrations, but it was not declared to be a legal holiday until 1941. Interestingly, two people on that five-person committee, Jefferson and John Adams, died on the 4th of July, exactly 50 years after it was adopted. In 1826, both of those pioneers, their lives came to an end. John Adams wrote this. He said that July 2 will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. Celebration should include pomp, parade, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations, word for fireworks, from one end of the continent to the other. And so America became the land of the free and the home of the brave. And Revelation chapter 13's prophecy, talking about the emergence of a beast from the earth that had two horns like a lamb, representing civil and religious liberty, came about. And precisely according to the dictates of prophecy and its timing and its characterization, America came to be. It was really a bold and new experiment. This idea that you could have a country without a king and a church without a pope. Keep in mind that a lot of the pilgrims came here seeking refuge, seeking asylum from the persecutions that raged during the Middle Ages at the hands of the church, religious persecution. So it was a daring declaration, and for a number of months after the signing of that document, the names were withheld from the public for the reasons of safety for those that had put their John Hancock on the document. And of course, John Hancock was the president of the Continental Congress, and right in the middle at the top there, the top line of signatures, you find his very bold signature. Now, whether it's true that he said something like, "I hope King George can read this," we don't know. There's dispute about what he actually said, but nevertheless, his signature is on it, as well as the other representatives of the Continental Congress. Divine direction. We as Christians, as Bible believers, particularly as Seventh-day Adventists, find in this portion of history fulfilled prophecy. We believe that God had his hand in the formation of America. There are so many stories that can verify this. We don't want to take too much time today. I just will mention that happenings prior to this event and subsequent to it give evidence that God was leading us. In the successful landing of the Pilgrims, their survival that first terrible winter, in George Washington's being protected during the wars that preceded the American Revolution, he would come away with bullet holes in his coat, and yet his body was untouched by the bullets, so much so that one Indian chief advised his warriors, stop wasting bullets firing on that man. He's protected by God. So we do believe that God had his hand in the establishment of America, that it was his purpose, that this would be the cradle where exciting new truths would be discovered and shared and promulgated throughout the world. And that America, being the beast from the earth, according to Revelation 13, would fulfill the purpose that God had for it. So we believe that God sponsored the formation of America, and we also believe that God, his hand shielded America so that it could survive the ravages of the Civil War. A thought came to me this week that I want to share, and maybe you've thought about it before, but it was new to me. The American Civil War, which began in 1861 and went on through another 4 years or so, occurred shortly after the formation of our church. And when I say the formation of our church, that's not really accurate entirely, because our church was not legally formed until 1861, 1862, in that era. And so you have the emergence of what would become the nucleus of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, although that name wasn't given immediately. And then right after that, you have this terrible, terrible war that took place. And you might be able to see in that war a number of things. Certainly it was God's purpose that the sin of slavery be removed. But more than that, you can see perhaps Satan's purpose to divide and destroy America, because that's been his strategy all along, to divide and conquer. And as he saw this nucleus of a new movement coming about that would be purposed with sharing the three angels' messages with the entire globe, perhaps he thought that a war that would disunite America and make it much less able financially and otherwise to support a movement like this could accomplish his purpose. But his purpose, of course, was defeated, and God's purpose was won out. During the middle part of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln, who recognized the jeopardy that America had fallen into by this war, wrote these comments that became the Gettysburg Address. You know that he was not the featured speaker for the event at which he gave this speech, but he was going to offer a few comments, and he scratched them out on his way on the train to the place where it was taking place. And his short speech became the one that is well remembered. And he expressed his thought that these dead, scattered, of course, on the field of Gettysburg, but all throughout the wars that occurred during the Civil War at that time, these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. So Abraham Lincoln recognized that there was a very serious, critical thing taking place in this Civil War that could divide and bring America as we know it to an end. We believe that God had his hand in the formation of this country, and Sister White supports that idea. She wrote this: "The greatest and most favored nation upon the earth is the United States. A gracious providence has shielded this country and poured upon her the choicest of heaven's blessings. Here the persecuted and oppressed have found refuge. Here the Christian faith in its purity has been taught. The people have been the recipients of great light and unrivaled mercies." Now, she wrote that on the 4th of July in the year 1899, many years, of course, after the Civil War had been completed and many decades after 1776. But she recognized, under the inspiration given to her by God, that something unusual, something special happened in the formation of America, and that God's hand has been upon this nation ever since for his purpose. Now, if you read the rest of that article in the Signs of the Times, you'll find that she goes on to say that to a large extent, America has not lived up to the blessings that has been given to her. And I can't help but wonder what she would say if she were writing today, looking upon America and seeing the decline in spirituality that has taken place. So we're thinking today about what is independence, what is liberty, what is freedom. And we're going to find out that Satan has his definition of what freedom is. God has his definition, dramatically different. And we can see that this earth, especially as we near the last closing hours of Earth's history, this earth is the battleground on which will be determined which of those two definitions is the correct one. And as we're going through this study today, I invite each one of us to consider prayerfully and carefully, what is the definition that we accept as far as what is liberty, what is freedom, what is independence? Satan's definition, to put it in a very succinct way, is that it is freedom from law. Freedom from law. That's how you get real liberty. That's what real independence is, to not have the restraint, the confinements of law. The Bible spoke about this in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Paul wrote this: "For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work." Goes on to say, "And then the lawless one will be revealed." And he says, "The coming of the lawless one is according to," it beats in harmony with, it is in alignment with the working of Satan. 2 Thessalonians 2. Let's take a closer look at that word that's translated lawless there. Now, we have the King James on the left-hand side, and of course, we're using our Blue Letter Bible on our iPhone to have access to these words. You don't have to know Greek in order to do this. If you have never experimented with that, I sincerely invite you to use that as a Bible study tool. So if you dig a little deeper into the passage, you find here with the English words on the left, "And then shall that wicked," that's how King James translates the word lawless, "then shall that wicked be revealed." We're taking a look at this word that has been translated wicked or lawless, and that's pronounced onomos. Here's it is, of course, in the Greek script, but there it is in English. So you don't have to know Greek even to do this. Onomos. And when you break that word apart, put it under the microscope, you find that it's composed of the first part, which is the letter A, alpha, And what that means is not. It's a negative particle, like we would say un in our language. And the root of the word is this word nomos, that means law. So you have not law. And the definition that's given here in the dictionary is to be destitute of law, departing from law, violator of law, lawless, wicked, and so on. Used 10 times in the Greek New Testament and translated these different ways. So there you have the word that Paul uses, anomos, and it means not, and we find that same idea expressed in words like asymmetrical or asymptomatic, a word that we're hearing more and more now during the COVID-19 era. And so that's the not part. And then the other part of the word is nomos. It means law. And you have that incorporated into a large number of English words. Astronomy, astro is stars, and nomos, law. So those who study the order, the arrangement, the laws by which the stars are guided, that's called astronomy. Or economy, house plus law. Or autonomy, self-rule, self-law. So anomos means without law. And though that word did not come into the English language directly, a synonym of it did come into our language from the Greek language, and it's anarchy. Again, without, and archy, rule. So Satan's definition is freedom from law. No, get rid of all the laws, and then you'll be truly free. Then you'll experience independence and liberty if you have no laws that hold you back. What Paul is saying in 2 Thessalonians 2 there is that through his agent, which in this case is the historical system of the papacy, we're not talking about people, we're talking about the hierarchy, the government of the papacy, but through that entity, who was the lawless one of Paul's prophecy, Satan worked out his purpose to attack God's sacred law. Someone might say, well, Pastor John, you're being a little bit hard, aren't you, on Roman Catholicism? The papacy really didn't remove God's law. They just changed it just a little bit. Well, that word is actually in the prophecy of Daniel 7, referring to this very same entity. It says he will think to change times and the law. But to modify or change God's in any respect actually amounts to a more effective assault than an outright removal. You see, if Satan had determined to remove the law completely from the scripture, that would arouse suspicion. People would recognize that as being not something that is right. But to modify it, to change it, that might be more acceptable. And that's exactly what happened. Through the papacy, there was an attempt to change God's law by removing the second commandment and by changing and largely reducing the fourth commandment and then splitting the 10th commandment into two to arrive at 10 as a total. So look at what James said here. For whoever shall keep the whole law yet stumble in one point, he's guilty of all. So to modify or change in just one respect God's law makes you guilty of all. And Jesus said that as well. Whoever therefore breaks one, now notice that phrase, one of the least of these commandments, and teaches men so, shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. One of the least of these commandments. Well, when you think about it, the two commandments that Satan attacked certainly would not be called the least of them. Because the second commandment that has to do with image worship and the fourth commandment are the two commandments that are by far the longest of them all. In fact, I was going to do a count. How many words are there in the 10 commandments in their entirety with the second and fourth there in their original condition? And how many words are there in the 10 commandments with the second one removed and the fourth one greatly reduced? And of course, the 10th one being split. But I think that you would find that there would be a great change numerically, quantitatively, by removing those two commandments, the two largest one. Daniel 7:25 predicted just such an attempt to change God's law. What is Satan's purpose? It is to attack God's law. And modification, change of his law is equivalent to nullification of it. We find a number of examples of this in the Bible. Cain worshiped, he built an altar and he put something on it, but his worship was a modified worship. It was not one in obedience to God's express command. There was worship at Mount Sinai. When Moses went up to the mount to receive the commandments, the people became impatient. There was a worship service that was conducted there at the foot of Mount Sinai, but it was a modified worship. It was a worship that changed God's express command. When you think about what happened at Mount Sinai there, it's so sad. Who was the worship leader there that conducted that worship service? It was Aaron. He was the highest ranking official of the church, the congregation. And yet it was he that Satan induced under the pressure of the people to engage in that modified form of worship. When I think about that story and what Aaron said to the people, I think that, sad to say, ironically to say, you could say that they were prophetic in a sense, because he made the Baal image. Of course, Baal worship was sun worship. He made the Baal image, and then he made this declaration to the people. Notice what he said very carefully. He said, tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. So what can we say? Aaron said, tomorrow's a feast to the Lord. We can say that instead of the seventh day, God's true Sabbath, the papacy has said tomorrow, that is the first day of the week, is a feast to the Lord. So worship or obedience that is changed, has modified God's law, is something that is not acceptable. What happened at Mount Carmel was worship with the Baal worshipers up there, but it did not conform to God's express command. All of these were unacceptable because the only true and acceptable obedience is full obedience that doesn't attempt to change or get rid of law. That's what Satan thinks liberty is, to get rid of law. Then you can experience true independence. That's what he preached to Eve in the Garden of Eden. You don't have to obey God. You'll be lifted to a higher sphere of experience if you set aside God's command. We can think of the demoniac there in Mark chapter 5 as being an example, a poster child of Satan's type of liberty. What does the Bible say? Speaking of the demoniac, it says he had his dwelling among the tombs and no one could bind him. Well, there you have it. This man is free. He is unfettered, not even with chains. He had often been bound with shackles and chains. The chains had been pulled apart by him. The shackles had been broken in pieces, and neither could anyone tame him. What a word that is, the word tame. What do you associate with the word tame? You associate animals. And this man was living an animal type of existence, but he's the type of freedom that Satan would like to lead everyone into. Yes, sure, you couldn't put chains on him. You couldn't tame him, but you have to ask yourself, was this man free? Was this man experiencing liberty and independence? I think we would all say that he was not. So we're going to take a look back now and examine the background, the roots of these two different definitions, two different concepts regarding freedom and law. This is what Sister White tells us. This is from the beautiful book, Patriarchs and Prophets. If you've not read that lately, I invite you to do so. And we're going through that book on our Wednesday night prayer meeting. So please join us at 7 as we go through this wonderful book. But in this book, it tells us about the beginnings of the clash of the concepts about what is freedom. The law of love being the foundation of the government of God, the happiness of all intelligent beings depends upon their perfect accord with its great principles of righteousness. So long as all created beings acknowledged the allegiance of love, there was perfect harmony throughout the universe of God. There was no note of discord to mar the celestial harmonies. But a change came over this happy state. There was one who perverted, what does the word pervert mean? To change. One who perverted the freedom that God had granted to his creatures. Little by little, Lucifer came to indulge the desire for self-exaltation. In heavenly council, the angels pleaded with Lucifer. The Son of God presented before him the greatness, the goodness, the justice of the Creator, and the sacred, unchanging nature of his law. Going on a little further, he, Lucifer, began to insinuate doubts concerning the laws that governed heavenly beings, intimating that though laws might be necessary for the inhabitants of the worlds, angels, being more exalted, needed no such restraint. For their own wisdom was a sufficient guide. Here we have the kernel of one of Satan's greatest fallacies, and that is that there can be rules, but they don't apply to you. They apply to other people, but not to you. And that's the type of false thinking that he put into the angels' minds, that the laws that God had put in place were actually restraints. They held them back so that they could not experience liberty and independence and freedom that Lucifer offered. Again, as Sister White says, to the very close of the controversy in heaven, the great usurper continued to justify himself. When it was announced that with all of his sympathizers, he must be expelled from the abodes of bliss, then the rebel leader boldly avowed his contempt for the Creator's law. He reiterated his claim that angels needed no control, but should be left to follow their own will, which would ever guide them right. He denounced the divine statutes or laws as a restriction of their liberty. What is Satan's definition of freedom? Freedom from law. The divine statutes were a restriction of their liberty and declared that it was his purpose to secure the abolition of law. That freed from this restraint, the hosts of heaven might enter upon a more exalted, more glorious state of existence. A clash of concepts, different definitions. Satan's is that liberty is freedom from law. He implanted those concepts of lawlessness in the human mind, and his campaign slogan of what freedom is found when law is absent, and that you can do whatever you want to do without the confining restraints of law. The Bible speaks to this, talks about man and its sinful condition. It says, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone, what direction? To his own way. That's Satan's type of thinking. Everyone to his own way. That's what he told the angels up in heaven. That's what he told the people on earth. We have this played out, sadly, in the book of Judges specifically. That book concludes with this verse. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And if you read the book of Judges, what do you have? You have a chronicle of sad experiences. When there is no law, then bad things happen. Again, continuing with this idea in Proverbs, we have a couple of texts. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he who heeds counsel in that case would be the teachings, the laws of God. He who heeds counsel is wise. Chapter 14, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. And today, as we look up on our sad world and our sad country, we find that it is immersed in this concept of freedom from law. Do your own thing. Throw off the restraints, the bindings of law, and you will experience true freedom. Myself growing up in the era of the 60s, the culture, the media, the music were all saturated with that idea to do your own thing and you will be truly free. Rules don't apply. Getting around the law. That's an idea that is popular with many people. And I learned this week that I found interesting. Elmer Berger was the first to market something that now every car comes equipped with this. But 100 years ago or so, it wasn't that way. And he developed a device, and it was what we would today call a rear view mirror. You could go to a hardware store and purchase for about $3.50 a piece of mirrored glass, about 3 by 5 or so, and it came with attachments so that you could put it up in a position so that you could look behind you. Well, you might think, what was the purpose of such a device? Obviously, it was for safety, so that you could keep track of cars that might be coming up behind you in that way. That was not the marketing that Elmer Berger used to sell his rear view mirror. What was it that he used as a campaign slogan to get people to buy his beer? It wasn't promoted for safety. It was marketed as a cop spotter. The whole concept was, put this mirror on your top part of your windshield there, and then you can see when the authorities behind you, and then you can obey the law. But if you don't see that in your rear view mirror, then you can go ahead and break the law and speed to your heart's content. Of course, the modern versions of such things are like that are fuzzbusters and other devices that help you get around the law. So what is liberty? Is it freedom from law, as Satan's definition declares, or is it according to God's definition of what constitutes independence and freedom? God has his definition, and it's freedom within law. You can see these two definitions are totally opposite one another, 180 degrees opposite. In the beautiful 119th Psalm, which is a classic, 176 verses dedicated to exonerating and exalting God's law. And every single verse of those 176, with the possible exception of 2 or 3, there is a word, a synonym to describe God's law, his precepts, his statutes, his commandments. He uses numerous different definitions, but it's all about God's law. And in verse 45, David says, I will walk at liberty, for I seek your precepts. I'm not trying to get around them. I'm not trying to change them. I'm not trying to put them away. I am seeking for them. And in this way, I will experience liberty, freedom, and independence. That's God's way of thinking. James agrees with that. He says, he who looks into the perfect law of liberty. Now, I'll put it on a pause right there and just consider that according to Satan's way of thinking, these words would not belong in the same phrase. Law of liberty? No, Satan would say those two words don't go together. But the Bible supports that idea. God's definition is freedom within law. And so James could call the 10 Commandments a perfect law of liberty. He who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this one will be blessed in what he does. And then just a few verses later in chapter 2, he repeats that idea. So speak and so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. So those are the two concepts, the different definitions. What is liberty? Today is a day, July 4, that word comes into our mind, the day of independence. Give thought. What is independence? What is liberty? What is freedom? Is it according to Satan's definition, freedom from law? Or is it according to God's definition, freedom within law? And we will see that as this world comes to its final climactic end, that this clash of concepts will be in focus. Is it freedom within God's law, or is it changing, modifying, setting aside, disobeying God's law? Well, prophecy gives us a very clear picture of what the future holds. Revelation 13:11, I saw another beast coming up out of the earth. First beast came up out of the sea. That represented the historical papacy coming out of the sea, the multitudes of Europe at that time. But this beast was different. It came up out of an uninhabited area. And it came up just as the other beast was suffering a decline. He had 2 horns. Horns represent power in prophetic scripture. 2 horns like a lamb, and spoke as a dragon. So in this one verse, we see the dramatic conflict, the 2 definitions coming into play between Christ and Satan. The horns like a lamb representing the civil and religious liberty that this nation came into being, characterized by those, and yet speaking like a dragon, using force, coercion, impinging on conscience. That's what prophecy has said this nation is heading toward. Predicts today that the day will come that though this country was birthed in freedom, intolerance and persecution will return, copying the practices of the Middle Ages. That's what the image of the beast is all about. America, led by fallen Protestantism, will initiate the movement to restrict religious freedom. And in 2020, we've been given a lecture on how quickly things can change and how the government can step in instantly and tell you what you can and cannot do. And prophecy says that in a more important critical aspect, impinging upon religious freedom, this will take place in the future. Protestantism will join hands with the system of the papacy to bring this about. We think of the Liberty Bell. There's a large amount of interesting history that I looked up this week about the Liberty Bell, but it was crafted long before the Declaration of Independence was proclaimed and signed. but it was kind of adopted as a symbol of liberty, particularly later as the Civil War loomed. It was adopted by abolitionists to represent what they were, what they thought of as being the foremost centerpiece of our country, freedom, and that the Civil War was to achieve freedom in that sense. But I want you to take a look at that bell. Very early on, it developed flaws, fractures. And then finally, the last time that it was rung, which was in 1846, a very large crack came to be seen in it, and that was the last time that it was rung. But I ask you this question, this Liberty Bell that was crafted to promote independence, the Liberty Bell on which is written, proclaim liberty throughout all the land, the inhabitants of thereof. Could it be that that crack in the Liberty Bell might actually prefigure the future fracturing of freedom that prophecy speaks about? So we've thought about the daring declaration that the signers performed when they put their signatures on the document, how God led in the formation and in the survival of this country so that it could be the place where certain truths would be promulgated to the entire world, the three angels' messages. We've taken a look at different definitions of what independence and liberty and freedom are all about, and how the Bible predicts that this country, though it was birthed in freedom, will nevertheless one day speak as a dragon. The good news is that the Bible gives us a wonderful finishing to the story, that there is an imminent means very soon to come, imminent independence. Now, Jesus came 2,000 years ago to give liberty and freedom. And we read the passage from Isaiah being quoted in Luke chapter 4. He was handed that book when he found it, found the place that it was written. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. And so Jesus came to give us liberty. And the liberty that he came to establish was freedom, freedom from guilt, freedom from the burden of past sins, and freedom from the power of sin. And yet today in 2020, we recognize that we're still held captive by mortality. We're not today experiencing the total independence and freedom and liberty that God wants to give. But one day soon, Jesus will come and he will proclaim the ultimate declaration of independence. When Christ comes in the sky, that will be the Independence Day that you and I are looking forward to. Maybe there won't be fireworks as we know them, but what about angels singing? What about graves opening? What about receiving a new body that is free of fatigue and disease and death? What about seeing the King in his glory? That will be an Independence Day worth living for. So I ask you in conclusion, what is your definition of freedom? Is it God's definition, freedom within law, liberty to obey him by the power of his Spirit? Or is it an attempt to shrug off, to disdain, to change, modify, set aside law? That's the definition that Lucifer has. I can tell you this, that in the world to come, it will be God's definition that will rule. It will be the law of love that will be in everyone's heart, and that will give us harmony and peace and true independence. May that day come soon. May it find every single one of us being part of that glad company is my prayer.